Going to begin to share my screen and give you guys a second or two to arrange all of your different desk icons and stuff like that, and all the pictures where you want it to be so that it works as we go. All right. People are still coming in. I'll give another second or two. I hear the dings. All right, my friends. So for those who have been tracking and taking the classes with me over the course of not just this year, but the last couple of years, I really have tried for these last 3 years to divide how I teach and teach different things in different trimesters. So the first trimester is always something that is timely, that really has relevance to what's going on in the world right now. And so we taught about the Jewish views on racism and intolerance. The second trimester is always about a biblical book, or has been, at least for these last few years, that we don't teach very often. And so we had a great conversation about the book of Job for these last for this last trimester. And in the third trimester, I try to do something that speaks to spirituality. And so we're going to speak about the spirituality of Abraham Joshua Heschel. There are few people in my life that I say, I really wish I would have been there then to learn from him, because I was at the school at which he taught. Heschel is one of those people. I very much wish that I would have been able to be at Jewish Theological Seminary when Heschel was teaching there, and learn from him and take classes from him. The good news for all of us is that he wrote an awful lot, which we'll see, and we can still learn from him as we go through. So, what do these 5 weeks sort of look like in terms of the class? Today, we're going to focus on his history, his biography, a little bit of an introduction into Heschel. We're not going to dive into the texts yet today, because in order to understand where he's coming from, we really need to understand who he was as a human being, and how he grew up, because it shaped everything that he did. Next week, we're going to focus on God and prayer, and how he understood the theology, Jewish theology, and how he understood prayer as a means to communicate with God. April 20th, we're going to talk about people in action, looking at his text, looking at his readings. He spoke a lot about the Jewish people and what it means to be a human and a Jew. And we're going to learn about that. And obviously, we can't study Heschel without understanding how he saw social action and our purpose in the world. He was a major part of that. Then on the 27th, we're going to focus on Shabbat. And we're going to try to drill down a little bit more and really look at some of the text and examine some. We're going to look at text through all of these, but really examine some of the text just on Shabbat, because he helped reshape for a lot of people in the modern world the way we understand Shabbat, the way we relate to Shabbat. And then finally on May 4th, which is the final day of the class, we're going to have a conversation and really figure out, what does this mean for us today? What is Heschel's legacy? What can we learn from it? How does it affect me as a Jew in the 21st century here in San Diego? How does it affect? How can it affect the way that we relate to all of these different topics? Any questions on the syllabus? Okay. So Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel really spoke throughout the ages. He started young in Europe, and he wrote and he taught and he spoke. And as he sort of went through his life and his existence, it just evolved. His theology, his philosophy evolved. Apologies to Peter, who asked why just San Diego? A Jew anywhere. I just happen to be in San Diego. Peter's on the East Coast. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about who he was and where it is that he came from. His biography. He was born in Warsaw, in Poland. His father was Moshe Mordechai Heschel, and he died when he was 9 years old. So much of his formative teenage years growing up was without a father in the house. His mother's name was Razel Perlo Heschel. And one of the things that really defined him is he came from actually two different, very illustrious Hasidic lines in Europe, his descendants. And he grew up in that ultra-Orthodox world. For those who we spoke about it when we talked about unorthodox, for those who are watching Shtisel, right? That is the world that Heschel grew up in Europe. And he studied in yeshiva. He received Orthodox ordination from that world. And it was at some point in time, right? Well, we know exactly when. It was in the 1930s that he decided to start to look elsewhere, to start to step out of that world. And his brain, his mind took him into other types of study. Hold on a second. There we go. So in 1933, he actually went and received a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Berlin. Now, remember, he was born in 1907. So, I mean, I guess it's about the time that most people would, maybe a little bit later. But he moved to Berlin from Warsaw and received his doctorate, studied at the university, and it's there that he actually taught in the university in Berlin and started his academic career. He wrote three, they weren't quite books, monographs, they weren't really articles either, but he wrote three different ones. In 1935, he wrote a biography of Maimonides. In 1936, he actually went back to Poland. It was published in Poland, actually. He wrote a book which translates as The Prophets, and we'll come back to that later on. It turns out that that was actually based on his doctoral dissertation. And in 1937, he went back. He published in Berlin a biography of Rabbi Isaac Abravanel. And so he seemed to, at least in his early career, gravitate towards these biographies. And I think what's interesting, I think it continued to inform the way that he wrote. When he wrote some of his later books, he wrote them almost like a biography, sometimes a biography of the Jewish people or a biography of God, but he wrote them very, very similar to that. Now, if people are paying attention to the dates and the place, this is 1930s in Berlin, in Germany. And so the world is going to get crazy very, very quickly. And in October of 1938, he, with a lot of other people who had Polish passports, were deported from Germany back to Poland. And the story that he's told, and his daughter actually tells, is that he actually was packed in on a train and stood for the entire 3-day trip back to Poland. Now, that was one part of his his career. But at the same time, he was, after those first couple of years of teaching, he actually also joined in to an institute, right? And my German isn't very good, but it translates as the Higher Institute for Jewish Studies, Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. Now, Wissenschaft actually is the German word for science. And for those who are familiar with the history of the conservative movement, you know that Wissenschaft des Judentums is a major part of the way that conservative Jews, especially the early conservative thinkers, thought about Judaism. And it came from here. It came from Heschel and some of these other people that we're going to see. But this institute was actually founded in 1870 by Abraham Geiger. Now, Geiger, for those who are familiar with Jewish history, is a major force in the Reform movement and the establishment of the Reform movement. And we have to understand that at this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, that is when the establishment of the Reform and then the conservative movement was happening in Germany and in Western Europe. It's because of Enlightenment. It's because of all those things that were going on. And Geiger and his school here was a major, major part of that. Most of the great thinkers at some point in time studied or taught in this Hochschule. And what made it so unique was that it was not affiliated with any denomination. We weren't really talking so much about denominations yet, certainly when it was established. But it sought free inquiry with no limitations, right? You study and you go where the study takes you. You're not limited by the constraints of traditional halachic thought on the one hand. You're not limited solely by the scientific methods that are being taught in literary criticism and stuff like that in the universities, in the academic worlds, but you're able to actually bring them together and almost take the best from both worlds. That was the idea behind all of this. And here Heschel studied with some of the greatest scholars, Hanoch Albeck, Ismar Elbogen, Leo Beck, for those who know their history. These are the greats, and some of them taught there, some of them learned there along with him. But this is where he got he's now taken the Jewish traditional that he grew up with, the academic that he learned in the University of Berlin, and is now starting to find a way to combine them in a way that made sense to him. Well, by 1940, Germany is invading Poland, has already invaded Poland, and Heschel was able to flee to London with the help of Julian Morgenstern. Now, Morgenstern was the president at the time of Hebrew Union College, which is the center of learning for the Reform movement in the United States. And HUC, Morgenstern, and a number of other people were actively trying to get Jewish scholars out of Europe, certainly out of Poland and Eastern Europe, where their life was really in imminent danger. But as we'll see, even after that from London, he was able to get out shortly after that. Alexander Goodman, another name that people may recognize if you know Jewish history and Jewish scholarship. He was actually secretly rewriting some of these people's rabbinic ordination because the United States didn't take smicha from these Hasidic Rebbe's, right? You needed some sort of a document that the people here in the US are going to recognize as, oh, this is rabbinic ordination, therefore we need you to be able to come and you have a place here. So Gutman was actually rewriting these ordination certificates and helping them get out. Later that year, not too long afterwards, they moved pretty quickly with Heschel. They brought him to the United States and they brought him directly in to teach at HUC, and he taught there for 5 years. For his first 5 years here in the United States, he taught at Hebrew Union College. Any questions so far? You're welcome. If you have a question, just stop me as we go. Otherwise, I'll just kind of keep going through. Okay. In 1946, Heschel switched from HUC, from the Reform movement, to Jewish Theological Seminary, and he took a full professorship in Jewish ethics and mysticism. That was his official title in 1946. Now, obviously, he wound up teaching a lot more than just that, but that's the professorship that he came in. And he ultimately taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary until his death in 1972. He lived on Riverside Boulevard, very, very close to the seminary, and would walk. That's where he would daven. That's where he would teach. That's where his existence was, in that Upper West Side of New York. That same year that Heschel took the job at JTS, and I don't know if I mentioned it before, but for most people, you should know that Jewish Theological Seminary is the flagship educational, especially at that point in time, institution of the conservative movement. So he moved from the Reform movement to the conservative movement. I just want to make sure that's clear. Later on that year, he married Sylvia Strauss, a concert pianist. 10 years later, they had a daughter by the name of Susanna, who ultimately herself became a Jewish scholar and teaches and lectures out of Dartmouth and still continues to do so even today. These are pictures of Heschel and Susanna. I really tried to find a picture of Sylvia. I could not find one. Partially is because I don't know what she looks like, but there was nothing out there. I searched the internet. I couldn't find a picture of Heschel and Sylvia. Maybe Sylvia was camera shy. I don't know. But on the left, you see a picture of Heschel with Susanna when he was alive, and she was significantly younger. And on the right is a picture of Susanna Heschel now. So that is by way of biography, right? And the piece that I want to take out of this is Heschel is a product of two very distinct worlds. He grew up in that ultra-Orthodox world, in the Hasidic world, and he lived and worked in the modern world, and with the tools of modern scholarship. And one of the reasons that made him such a pillar of the conservative movement is the combination of those two ideas is very much what the conservative movement tries to accomplish. And Heschel was able to do it in himself, and he tried to show other people how to do it in his writings. And that's what I really sort of want to move on to for the second part of this class. In order to understand Heschel, we have to sort of understand what are his major works, major writings, and what do they come to teach us before we dive into the texts themselves. So we think about bibliography. He was a very, very prolific writer. He wrote speeches, he wrote essays, he wrote articles and books. One of the speeches I actually quoted from earlier on in this year was in the 1960s that he wrote, a very famous speech that ultimately got him noticed by Dr. Martin Luther King and had that connection, which ultimately became a friendship between the two of them, was a speech that he gave on the need for the Jewish community to be involved in the civil rights movement. So he was out there. He was very, very active. And something that actually I think Saul Kempinski brought up when we were discussing it back in the initial class, it didn't make him all that popular with some of his colleagues who were trying to not rock the boat and not get involved politically and those sorts of things. And there were pluses and minuses to what it is that he did. Ultimately, most people accepted and adopted and supported what it is that he did. There are 6 major works that define and sort of shape what we know about Heschel and Heschel's theology. And these are the works from which, for the most part, we're going to be drawing texts throughout this course. The first was a book called Man Is Not Alone. And as much as I could, I tried to find first edition covers just so we saw what it is that we look like. You can still buy this today. It doesn't quite look like this. This is a first edition cover. This was actually his first major published work in English. Most of the other stuff that he had done up to this point in time had either been in German or in Hebrew, but this was really his first major work in English. And as I was looking for information about these books, I actually found Macmillan Publishers, who is one of the publishers that he actually published with early on with this and still publishes his books. For a couple of the books, they wrote such beautiful text on it. So for this one, I want to bring you what they said about this book. Man is Not Alone is a profound, beautifully written examination of the ingredients of piety, how a man senses God's presence, explores it, accepts it, builds life upon it. Abraham Joshua Heschel's philosophy of religion is not a philosophy of doctrine or the interpretation of dogma. He erects his carefully built structure of thought upon foundations which are universally valid but almost generally ignored. And that line stood out to me so much because when you read his stuff, there's almost, first of all, once you can understand it, because his writing is not always so easy to decipher. It's very, very dense writing. But once you understand the concept, it's like, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That, like, why didn't we think of that? Like, and he puts it out there, and it's so obvious, right? It's valid, but we just tend to ignore some of these things, some of these important pieces. It was Man is Not Alone, which led Reinhold Niebuhr to accurately predict that Heschel would become a commanding and authoritative voice, not only in the Jewish community, but in religious life in America. Right? It was just a wonderful description, better than I could say. When we think about this particular book and what it does, he explores how we encounter what he describes as the radically different and ineffable God. And he actually coins a phrase in this book that we now use as part of it, radical amazement. And we'll talk a lot about that as we talk about this. But that is a phrase that Heschel coined in terms of how we relate to God, that we need to have this radical amazement in our lives of the awesomeness of God. So this was his first major book. It's probably not his most popular. The next one, which came out in the same year, is his most popular. It's called The Sabbath. And it's popular for a lot of different reasons. One, for those people who are interested in Judaism and want to learn about the Sabbath. It's a great title. Let's read it, right? It also is a deceptively short book. But it is a book that took me like the equivalent of a 1,000-page book to read because it's so dense. And so like I had to reread different sections of it. He paints such incredibly articulate and beautiful images. But it's tough language to get through and tough to understand. And what is he really trying to say? And what does that mean? Each sentence is so packed. In the Sabbath, he really brings this idea of the fact that Judaism is a religion of time, not space. And everything else in the world that we as human beings think about is all about space. But our religion is all about time. And that distinction is what makes it so unique and so special. That's really what he does in this relatively short book. He coins this image that we now use of Shabbat being a palace in time. Normally we think about Shabbat as, or normally think about a palace as in space, but for him, it was a palace in time. It is definitely a book for those people who like philosophy, for those people who want to dip their toe into Heschel. It's a book that I recommend, but anything you're going to read from him, this is not a sit down and read it in 3 days cover to cover type of book. It's a keep it on your shelf or keep it by your bed. Read maybe a page, maybe a paragraph, and then go to sleep and think about it for 3 days. Right? That's the type of book that it is as you read it. Michael, Frank.
Yeah, I read that book. The version I read had a foreword by his daughter. And
Okay.
his daughter spoke articulately, of course, because she's herself quite a impressive woman, but also very lovingly about him and about their Shabbats together while she was growing up.
Interesting. No, she is very, for a while, she was very private about her relationship with her dad. But she is actually, I think, understood over the years that he is a Jewish sort of national treasure. And those memories that she has of him and who he was really speak to all of us. And we all kind of want to share a little bit in that. And she's become much more open later on. In the beginning, she was very, very private about that. Any other questions? Okay. So after the Sabbath, so those were both in 1951. The next book that, okay, Diana, go ahead before I get into this one.
No, I had a super quick question. I was thinking about, why did he end up at HUC after being raised in this Hasidic environment rather than JTS? I think I missed maybe some of the connection, how he went.
Because it was HUC that got him out of Europe.
They got him. Okay, so they sponsored him, and
yeah, HUC was actively looking for these scholars and bringing them out of Europe and bringing them so they can teach, right? I mean, they were looking to bring people like Heschel into HUC and stuff like that, and so he taught there for 5 years before moving on.
Okay, and then also, did he get his smicha? Like, was it like he went to yeshiva, like high school, kind of one of those types of smichas? Okay, got it. All right, thanks.
Saul.
You know, Rabbi, it's interesting that of all places in Berlin, that Heschel was there with two of the other greats of North American, of Jewry, of 20th century Jewry, Soloveitchik and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And some say, I don't know if it's an urban legend, but they all actually lived in the same apartment complex in Berlin in the 30s. So Soloveitchik, Schneerson, and Heschel all were in Berlin, of all places, in the 30s, all going different directions, but it's just an interesting point of history.
That is really interesting. You know, I hadn't heard that, but there's definitely a sense that when you walk the halls of the Jewish Theological Seminary, right, that there were times that, you know, you would get Heschel and Mordechai Kaplan riding the same elevator together, right, at the seminary. And, you know, this thought, and then you get Saul Lieberman in there, right? And there was more Judaism in that elevator at that moment than probably anywhere else in the world, right? I mean, it was so, the fact that they were all there and all riding that elevator up and down, because it was this one little rickety elevator that they had at that time. You know, it's so that image I had, but I'd never heard Saul about some of the others in Berlin. Thank you for sharing that. So God in Search of Man, he wrote 4 years later. He wrote in 1955. And it was written and seen as the companion to Man Is Not Alone, to that first book that he wrote. So since it was a companion, I decided to bring Macmillan Publishers again to express it. God in Search of Man combines scholarship with lucidity, reverence, and compassion, as Dr. Heschel discusses not man's search for God, but God's search for man. The notion of the chosen people, the idea which he writes, signified not a quality inherent in the people, but a relationship between the people and God. It is an extraordinary description of the nature of biblical thought and how it becomes faith. So there's a couple of things in this that are really important in terms of what Heschel was doing in this book and in many of his books. This idea that it's not just us that needs God, but God that needs us is not revolutionary, and he brought it out of the Hasidic world, right? He brought that idea out of there's no doubt in my mind, he brought this out of the Hasidic world, and it brought this concept of relationship to our theology in the modern world. something that he knew and grew up with in the Hasidic world. We have a relationship with God, right? I mean, very often you would hear, and there was actually a scene in Shtisel that was like this. I remember with them walking around outside in the forest, and they're yelling "Tate," right, Father, right? That was the relationship that you had. This wasn't some distant, cold, amorphous sort of thing. You had a relationship, and God wanted that relationship with us as much as we wanted it with God. And this is what he starts to really talk about in this book. The other side of that relationship and the fact that it goes back and forth. It's dynamic, it's living, it's breathing. And that's what makes it so important and so vibrant. This idea that he talks at the end is a major part in this book. Thought becomes faith. Faith becomes a response. Right? And for him, and this was very much, by the way, a part of his civil rights ideology as well. You don't act merely from thought. You act because you believe. And that step, he would argue, we skip very often in the modern world. We try to go from thought to action, to response. And he says those are hollow without the belief, without the faith piece of it as well. Questions on that? So in 1962, he wrote a book called The Prophets. Now, if you remember, he wrote a German article, and he wrote his dissertation called The Prophets. So this started as a dissertation, went as to an article. This actually became a much larger work that he then added to. But it really was a scholarly focus, to some degree, on the prophets themselves. And he talked about them and talked about their personalities and their individuality and those sorts of things, and really looked at who the prophets are and what they mean to us. But in the midst of all of this academia that this book really did, he actually brought out one of the most fundamental ideas and world-changing ideas. We talk about God very often, and we struggle with it. God as being anthropomorphic, right? God as having human form in some way, or human attributes. But Heschel actually argued that God is not anthropomorphic. God is anthropopathic. That it's not that God has human attributes, but God has human feelings. And that reshapes, again, we're not trying to emulate God because we look like God, right? We're trying to emulate God and have a relationship with God because in the same way that we feel joy and we feel sadness and we feel disappointment and we feel anger, God feels those things too. And it actually is one of the things that connects us. And we're going to see later on, he talks about the prophetic mode of relationship with God as being one of the most pure and one of the most important for us as Jews. And he'll explain why, and we'll probably talk about that as part of our conversation about God. We have two more. Torah min hashamayim is the short version of this. Now, the full text of this, and I want you to see, this is how thick this book is, right? It actually was written in 3 volumes. The full text of this is Torah min hashamayim be'aspaklaria shel hadorot. Aspaklaria is a beautiful word. It means a mirror or a reflection. And dorot is the generations. So Rabbi Gordon Tucker has translated as heavenly Torah as refracted through the generations. This, as I said, originally was a 3-volume work. And this was an academic and spiritual excursus on rabbinic theology and Agadah. Now, for those who don't know that word, Jewish literature very often is divided into two different categories: halakha, law, and Agadah, pretty much everything else. We sort of say it's story, but it's not always story. It's values, its teachings, its understandings that aren't necessarily connected to legal matters. And he focuses on these. He actually published the first 2 volumes, was working on the 3rd volume, finished it, had never published it, and it was actually published posthumously by JTS Press, by the Jewish Theological Seminary Press. The school published it posthumously for him. And it focuses on the classic rabbinic ideas. So he's now taking all of these ideas, these images that he learned as a child, and reflecting them, as he says, through the generations, through the lens and the prism of academia and those things that we know through the modern world, and trying to make some sense out of them. Many people believe that this is his masterwork. It's certainly one of the longest, right? And again, it's not something that you can read, in an evening cover to cover. It's this actually, the way I use it is as a resource, right? When I'm talking about something, when I've got a theme or an idea, I want to see what Heschel may have said about it. It's a great way to use that as a resource that way. As I said, Rabbi Gordon Tucker was the one who ultimately edited and translated it into a 1-volume book that was published in 2006. And that's this book that you see and the cover that you see on the screen in front of you. The last major work that he has is a book called Who is Man that he wrote in 1966. And this is where Heschel, again, leaves the academic world and tries to go back into the philosophical world. And this is really a book of philosophy as Heschel tries to decide and figure out, who are we as human beings? What does it mean to be human? What rights does that give us? What obligations does that give us from a philosophical, spiritual, ethical perspective? And that is really the focus of this particular book. Any questions on either his life or his work before we kind of bring things to a close for today? Michael, Frank.
Yes, will you be elaborating on Heschel's view of God having human feelings later on in the class?
It will come out. One of the reasons, you see there's a lot of material here. We could spend easily a year-long course going through all of this, and this is just a taste. So the reason I actually intentionally took today to go through these books is to try and give you some overarching 60,000-foot idea of some of his concepts so that you'll be attuned to them when we read the text. He may not say things as explicitly. I may not hit on that point explicitly, but you're going to hear it through the way he describes God, the way he describes our relationship with God. You'll hear those overtones. And that's kind of what I wanted to sensitize you to as we were going through his text.
Okay.
There's so much depth in his philosophy that we're gonna dive into that and really sort of look at that from a Jewish theological perspective. That's just one part of it. Diana.
So I think, arguably he is one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. His stuff it's hard. I have several of these books. They're hard. And I'm glad that you're bringing this sort of to the people at a level that I think I'll be able to understand a lot better, because it's hard to not compare him with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Alav Shalom, right now. Everybody's like Rabbi Sacks, Rabbi Sacks, Rabbi Sacks, and Rabbi Sacks also brings in a lot of the philosophy as well. But I think the difference is he seems to connect better to more people, and I'm hoping that you will, um, through the next 5 weeks in this journey, that we'll be able to connect to Heschel in a more approachable kind of way.
So yes, I'm going to agree with what you're saying. Yes, he's hard. Yes, he's less approachable than some other people. It's interesting. I sort of feel like as we go through, there's sort of a generation of people who are philosophers, and then a generation afterward who are what I call the synthesizers, right? So to me, Rabbi Sachs, and he's brilliant, and is a synthesizer. He takes philosophy that is out there and brings it to us, delivers it in a way that we can understand, we can make use of, brings it out of the heavens, so to speak. Rabbi Elliot Dorff does the same thing. Rabbi Elliot Dorff taught the philosophy classes that I took at the University of Judaism. And he would assign these books to us, and I would spend hours and days and weeks reading them, cracking my head over them, and then he'd explain them, and I go, oh yeah, right? Because he just has the ability to do that. For me, when you look at somebody like Heschel, like a modern Orthodox equivalent would be Soloveitchik, right? Who's also hard. Right? The philosophers are hard because they're working so hard to craft the image of of how they view the world. And especially when you have somebody like Heschel, who was brilliant with language, and just his language itself is difficult, right? Let alone what he's trying to say. It makes it tough. So I will do my best. I make no promises. There's obviously no substitute for spending time with these books yourself and spending time getting to know him. But my intention with a 5-week class on this is hopefully I'll whet your appetite, and some of you will be challenged to go out and get buy one of his books, or pick it up off the shelf after you've put it aside, and reread it, and try to get something out of it with a little bit more guidance. Okay, Peter.
I always thought the genius of Heschel was that he was trying to make his early Hasidic philosophy more accessible to the secular Jew, and to the Reformed Jew in particular originally. The class I took on him came at it from a very Reformed perspective. And I understood him through my grandmother, who was a Viennese Jew of the same era as he was. She was born in 1899, so she was 8 years older and attended the University of Vienna. And a lot of the Polish concepts were so far beneath the German and the Viennese Jews, and Heschel made this more accessible for them.
So look, it's really interesting to try and ask the question, and maybe at the end of this class, we'll ask it again, Peter, like, what was his purpose? I think to some degree, his purpose was just the exploration of Judaism. But I think the buzzword, right, that we use nowadays is the big lie, right? The big lie for Heschel was that this world of Hasidic spirituality and this world of Wissenschaft, right, are mutually exclusive. They are two worlds that can never be brought together. And he never believed it. He never thought it. He never believed it. He never lived it. And I think what he spent, and we're going to see, I think what he spent his life trying to do is to break that big lie and to show that we can be educated, modern, scientifically oriented Jews who are exceedingly spiritual, right? And we still struggle with this to this day, absolutely. But I think that's what he was trying to do, and it actually is a good segue into just the last pieces here, right? the two things that we really took from today is that Heschel was a product of these two distinct worlds, Hasidism and this world of modern Jewish inquiry. And the combining factor was him, was an intellect, that he was able to somehow bridge these worlds and bring us to that modern Jewish theology that tends to be much more cold and scientific, that has compassion and spirituality in it also. To me, and this is now me speaking, right? That is what Heschel does. And that's why I find him so compelling, because it's the same struggle that I think we continue to have. We bounce back and forth, and we sort of have a foot in this world and a foot in that world, and we try to be spiritual, and then we try to be academic, and we kind of bounce back. And Heschel is arguing we can do both, and we can do it at the same time. And that's what he tries to show and to bring to us in his writings. And that's what I'm going to try to bring over these next 4 weeks, moving ahead. Questions. We'll sort of open it up for questions or comments. We have about 5 minutes, and then I'll let you guys know what's happening next week. But any questions? You guys all figured it all out. Rivka.
I just want to say, yay. I'm so excited that we're studying Heschel because I love him. I'm like you. I wish I had been in his world, that I could have just sat and soaked it up for a long time. So thank you.
There is a book that I have pulled a lot of my sources from, that if you're interested in getting a pre-digested a little bit, right? A little bit of a pre-digested view of Heschel, taken from all of his different works. It's an anthology that's called I Asked for Wonder. And it's a shorter book, and it has a lot of his best and greatest quotes. I've read all of these books at some point in time in my career. I did not reread them all for this class. There's no way I could have done that. So I'm using that as a guide. And so I recommend that if you want to sort of start to see different things that he says in categories, that I recommend you get that book. And you'll see I'm following along with a number of those categories in this. And so
Good.
I'm going to pick 3 or 4 of them, but there's another 7 or 8 of them that you may like to read as we go. Marcia and or David, I'm not sure who's raising their hand, and then Saul. Marcia. You have to unmute first, though.
Marcia, you're muted.
Yeah, she's looking for the unmute. It should be here. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this, and it'll make things easier because it'll put everything back on the bottom. You should be able to see on the bottom.
Yeah, okay, no, now I unmuted. Okay, fine.
There you go.
So I have a question, probably because we're in the midst of the Yom HaShoah. And you talk about Heschel saying that God has feelings versus the anthropomorphic, the whatever you said.
Anthropopathic.
Yeah, that. So thank you. I mean, I've read some of Heschel a while ago, but probably because we're in the midst of Yom HaShoah. Is there anything that he wrote in terms of the Holocaust, especially since he was there then?
Yeah.
Here, in terms of God's view of the Holocaust.
So there's nothing, unlike some other theologians that kind of went through the Holocaust, that wrote specifically to the Holocaust. I don't believe there's anything that Heschel wrote that is specifically Holocaust oriented.
Yeah, because I don't remember anything.
Yeah. That being said, there's no modern theologian, modern philosopher that that can exist that doesn't in some way have to deal with the Holocaust. So he does, but not directly, right? As you put together his worldview, he's got answers. And maybe afterwards, when we talk about God and prayer, we talk about man in action, especially like those two pieces. We can re-ask that question, Marcia, and try to say, so what would Heschel say, right? Understanding God and prayer and what that all means, and understanding how he views human beings and our obligation for action. How does he understand it?
Okay, thanks.
Saul.
First of all, Rabbi, thank you for a wonderful class.
Thank you.
You mentioned this, and I want to thank you for mentioning it. But in our world today, when we say ultra orthodox, we see a homogeneous sort of black blob of people that they're all the same. But I think it's and again, you did mention this, but I think it's really important that he really comes from a Hasidic tradition, and his spirituality, and I would even say his social activism in some way, would not have come if he didn't have that strong Hasidic background. And people, I think, realize in this class, but Hasidim was the Jewish renewal movement before there was a Jewish renewal movement. So it wasn't what it is today, which is much more structured. So he came from that background that enabled him to really put an emphasis on spirituality because he came from a Hasidic background.
I agree 100%. I mean, the thing we're going to keep coming back to again and again is he was able to do what he was able to do, write what he was able to write, teach what he was able to teach, because of these two pieces that met. If it weren't for those two pieces, he wouldn't have been Heschel. It was a very unique alchemy that sort of came together in him that allowed him to teach in that way. Peter.
I just want to take an aside for a quick second that I think this is almost a Heschel period that we are in, because I'm seeing such accessibility of learning in Judaism that goes between Hasidic philosophy and more modern Jewish thought through this whole COVID thing. We're sitting in this. And it is just an amazing total concept to me that we can be doing this virtually in the world today. And you can pick up a Daf Yomi class, you can pick up this kind of class, you can pick up a Tanya class, and we can bridge this as secular Jews anywhere in the world today. And it's just an amazing period for Jewish learning.
So I agree. I agree
just think
with
that's
your
an amazing thing.
I agree with your statement, Peter, that this is definitely a time of accessibility in a lot of ways that we haven't before. And it's been something that we've learned from COVID. The irony is, I don't find Heschel himself is not about accessibility. We're going to see, because I would venture to say, and this is my own annotation on this, that one of the reasons that Heschel is so difficult is because Heschel believed you had to work for this, right? This wasn't something that you just if you want a relationship, then you better work for that relationship. And so the accessibility piece of Heschel himself isn't necessarily there. But I agree with everything else that you're saying in terms of overall Jewish learning and all of that kind of thing.
We are working hard at this, okay? That's the whole point. We're all craving this now in our lives. And that's an amazing thing.
And Peter, we're glad that you're able to join us all the way as late as it is from the East Coast. I want to get to Elisheva has a question, and then I want to just close out.
So, Rabbi, this is for me completely new. But as I hear you speaking about in between two worlds, the Hasidic world and the scientific world, where are the mithnagdim? Because I have the feeling that, are we understanding the Hasidic world as the very profound and a lot of study? Because it was not. Because
No.
the most profound one was the Vilna Gaon. And so I think
Heschel does not represent the Mitnagid world in that way, frankly. Heschel represent the two worlds that Heschel represents are the Hasidic spiritual world, right? And the academic side of things he got from the secular world, not from the Mitnagid world. He had a rigorous academic at University of Berlin. You know, he had a rigorous academic pedigree and a mind that was able to do that. So his academic side of things, right, the study, the learning, didn't come from now. Hasidic Jews learn too. I don't want to, I don't want to say that they don't, but that desire for learning was not there. And I would even go so far as to say that yes, he was a teacher, yes, he taught, but Heschel never taught Talmud, or if he did, he didn't do it because that's what he wanted to teach, right? He taught ethics and mysticism and spirituality. That's what he taught because that was more important. And if you asked Heschel, I never have, right? Is it more important to go out and to follow these spiritual principles or to learn a blot of Gemara? He's going to say, go out and be spiritual. Leave the Gemara aside. That's the Hasidic tradition, right? And so Mitnagdim don't resonate to Heschel actually at all, right? You're not going to see that type of tradition in the Mitnagid world. It's going to be too close to the Hasidic tradition, right? And I mean, first of all, it's conservative, so they may not accept it no matter what. But philosophically, that's not his world. It's not his world.
so what he did it's probably something grandiose.
Yeah,
because
he brought Hasidism into the modern world.
Yeah.
That's what he did. He's a modern Hasidic Jew.
Okay.
That's who he is. A modern Hasidic Jew. Okay. So just for next week, I don't need to go back and share the last little thing. For next week, we're going to focus on God and prayer. And the format is really going to be, I'm going to bring a number of different sources. We're going to read them. We're going to discuss them. We're going to see what we think and try to figure out what we can learn from them. It's going to be a little bit of not Chavruta style, but Beit Midrash style of let's learn a text, let's look at it, let's talk about it, and try to figure out what we're going to, how we're going to make any sense of it. I saw something pop through my chat. Let me just, before I leave, some ways JTS of the 50s. Could I say in some way JTS of the 50s and 60s was a bit mitnagdim? Yes. Which is why it was so important that Heschel was there. You would get somebody like a Saul Lieberman, who was very mitnagid in his tradition, in the way that he saw things. And the entire Talmud department really took that type of you learn for the sake of learning, and the more Gemara you know, the better, right? That type of idea, I think, was very much a part of the seminary. And by the way, I don't know that it was that different when I was there. They had other things as well, but the role of Talmud and certainly what I took, right, was very, very much central in terms of what our curriculum was. We took a Talmud class every semester of every year that we were there. We didn't take a Bible class every semester of every year. We didn't take a Midrash class every semester of every year, right? We always had Talmud. All right, my friends, it is 8:31. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Or maybe we'll see some of you under the
Thank
tent
you,
on
Rabbi.
Shabbat.
That's true. I hear Diana's reading Haftorah.
It's a long one. Settle in, folks. Practice, got it done. Thanks. Have a good
Thanks.
rest of the week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night, all. Good night.